Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the beginning of a series of shows about Canada's involvement in World War II. But a rather bit of sad start to this because I'm going to dedicate this week of programming to Normandy historian Frederick Jeanne, who we lost tragically yesterday. It was a very sad story. I'm not going to go into details, but we lost Frederick at 36 years old. He leaves us a wonderful, rich legacy of the books he's created, and they are absolutely fantastic. Alas, they're only in French, but his work on Hold the Oak Line about the 7th Brigade, his work about the Polar Bears and the Armored Brigades in Fontenay will live on. He contributed to huge amounts of projects, films. He was trying to get a film about the Little Black Devils that are off the ground and other things and other projects, and we're all reeling from his loss. So I'm dedicating this week of shows to Frederick Jeanne. But on a less sad subject, I am delighted to welcome my guest back today. He will hold the world record of being the longest time since appearances. He was on the mammoth June the 6th broadcast did in 2020, but he was right near the end, and his bit ended up not being recorded by YouTube, so it's not left for you to watch. But my guest today is Mark Zuehlke of the indispensable Canadian Battle series, which is just, if you haven't got the books, go and get them. Normandy, Italy, the ETO, everywhere, and they are indispensable. Fantastic writing, and he's joining us today to talk about the river battles in Italy. So without further ado, I'll bring Mark in. So good morning, Mark. How are you today?
Good morning. Got a bit of a good. There seems to be a bit of a lag on the.
Hello.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but is there a delay or something?
All right. Seem to be having some technical. Okay.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah. There seems to be a bit of a. Oh, it's so. Yeah.
Try leaving and coming again, Mark. Try dropping out and coming back in. Sorry about that, folks. We were chatting for 10 minutes before we went live, and everything was fine. And then suddenly, as you know, Gremlins struck. But it just allows me to continue talking about Frederick, because he was an amazing historian. David O'Keefe, regular viewer and regular contributor, was a good friend of his. Worked with him for a long time. Everybody knew him. And social media is flooded today with messages about how generous he was with sharing of his information. He had an amazing collection of photos, and that's the legacy we're left with. But Mark seems to be back in. Let's hope things are better. Are you back? Is everything okay?
No. There's there's still this lag where you're
how weird.
Yeah. And if I turn off that speaker, you don't hear me.
I know, I'm still hearing you.
Or I don't hear you. That's one of the point.
You haven't got YouTube playing in the background, have you?
Oh, wait a minute. Shouldn't be. No. Oh, wait. Here, maybe. Oh, it was lurking around on my on the Edge browser for some reason.
And those multiple browsers. Oh well, we're back. So
yeah. Sorry about that.
No. So the river battles in Italy. I mean, you come on with a PowerPoint, and you know the thing about Canadian history is we were talking about before going live. Once you get beyond Hong Kong, the Falaise Gap, Dieppe, people's knowledge seems to kind of drop off a cliff in some ways. So, you know, do you find that when you do your books, that the big popular subjects do better and hold people's interest more than shouldn't call them obscure, but the lesser well-known subjects?
Yeah, certainly. What happens in Canada with the sales of books is looking at Juno Beach, which is the one specifically on June 6th. It remains probably the best-selling book I've had of the series. Ortona is sort of in number 2, which is interesting because when Ortona first came out, that battle was incredibly obscure. But in the last really 20 years, it's slowly gained more and more uh, momentum, and more people know about it. I know when we do our Italian campaign tours, it's Ortona. There's a lot of people come on the tour because we're going to go to Ortona.
Yeah.
So it's got that kind of cachet now, which is interesting because it's the only part of the Italian campaign that does. Generally, even though people know we were in Ortona, they don't know that the Canadians played this big role in the Italian campaign. So it's kind of a little bit of a dark horse. So yeah, it's an interesting aspect of it. And battles like the river battles, the Gothic line, and even the invasion of Sicily, they just don't get the same attention. And that's really what led me to doing these books. Is I'm going to make damn sure that they do get the attention.
Yeah, and I should remind folks, the links to Mark's book is in the description below, where you can find all the information. But we'll fire up the PowerPoint and get started. Mark, just tell me when you want me to move on slides. And folks, we'll do questions as we go along, so fire away with your questions. It's mostly just images and maps we've got tonight. So, but basically, over to you, Mark.
Okay, just pop a couple images forward, and one more. And okay, so what we're doing is actually this photo is taken on San Fortunato Ridge, which is just to the west of the city of Rimini. And it's where the Gothic Line campaign ended on September 22nd, 1944. And if you look out at that long, beautiful flat land out there, this was everything that 1st Canadian Corps had been fighting to get to. The idea, everyone looked out there, they could see this flat land running on and on and on. And this is the expanses of the Emilia-Romagna plain. So on September 22nd, 1944, 5th Canadian Armored Division, a bunch of officers were standing right where this photo was taken. And they're looking out at that, and they were really excited, because one of the things the tanks had never had a chance to do in Italy was actually do what tanks are supposed to do. They run wild. And they were looking out at those open spaces, and they were imagining, as Lieutenant Colonel Jim McCavity of the Lord Strathcona Horse put it, that we have entered the promised land, the wide open spaces where our tanks can run wild in their mad gallop to the Po. But as this photo shows, this is what they've been dealing with up to now. This kind of really rugged country. Tanks are being very vulnerable here because, particularly once the Germans got the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck deployed in Italy in January 1944. They started having the ability to really pick off tanks if you moving around, and that's why these tanks are spread out so much, is because it's really difficult, hard country to deal in. You can switch to the photo now. And so this is Tommy Burns, Lieutenant General Tommy Burns, and he commanded 1st Canadian Corps. And the Gothic Line battle had cost the Canadians really heavily. They had 4,511 casualties to get through the Gothic Line. Another 1,005 men were evacuated with illness, many of that being combat fatigue. And so a lot of those guys were not going to be returning to the front lines particularly. So Burns, who's had a hard time commanding the Corps at this point, he realizes that basically 1st Canadian Corps is hardly fit for future operations, but it's going to have to do so. And the Allied intention here, at this point, nobody is actually expecting to win a major victory in Italy. They're not expecting to, there was the old, soft underbelly of Europe, and that the Canadians the Allies were going to punch up through Italy, knock their way into Austria, and somehow get to Germany and win the war. Even Churchill Churchill who invented that idea. So at this point, everyone realizes that the Allies don't have the power to ever achieve that kind of a victory. What they're really looking at is no longer achieving a top, terrain victory. What they're really looking at is tying down the Germans and basically killing as many of them as they possibly can. And to keep these divisions that the Germans have put into Italy, keep them there, prevent them from being withdrawn and sent to Normandy or sent to the Russian front. So it's a very unglorious process that's ahead of us. And you can switch the photo again. So the immediate goal, they're coming out of Rimini and they're heading towards a town called Ravenna. That's the first objective. And you can see on this sign here that it's 52 kilometers away. Now that's not very far. It's a very, very short distance. And it's September 1944. But this campaign, we will see, extends to February 1945. And Ravenna gets taken, and that's about all in that time. So the great dashes into the Po just are not going to happen. What is happening instead, and you can see Rimini up here. I don't know if my pointer works.
No, pointer doesn't
okay.
work.
It's working for me, but not for anyone else. So you can see Rimini up in the top corner where the arrows are going, and you can see Ravenna. And that's the battlefield for a huge chunk of time, September to February. It's actually, the geography is actually 15 by 24 kilometers of ground in which all of this fighting takes place, in which, as it turns out, there will be 7,000 Canadian casualties suffered in just that ground. So it's an incredibly bloody area to fight in. And you can switch photos again.
And would it be fair to say, Mark, that the longer it goes on, the other two factors are the terrain and the weather and fatigue? I mean, some of these Allied troops have just been at the sharp end now for months, if not years, and you sort of see that drop off. People, we know now that in across the ETO, that winter desertions are running rife. People are getting fed up. There's a war weariness setting in. So as long as the longer it takes to crack a campaign, the more the morale of the men within it seem to just drop. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, it's definitely fair. In fact, this is a photo shows Major General Chris Vokes, who's the guy smoking the cigarette, standing next to Tommy Burns. And Chris Vokes commanded the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, which had been fighting since July 10th, 1943, when they came into Sicily. So they've been heavily engaged. That division saw the brunt of all of the fighting at Ortona. Then the 5th Canadian Armored Division joined them after that, and they fought through the Hitler Line on the Casino front, then the Gothic Line over again on the Adriatic coast. Thousands of casualties occur. By the time we're up here heading in towards Ravenna, you're probably looking at about 1 of every 5 Canadian soldiers in that division is a veteran of the Sicily campaign. The rest have been killed, wounded, are out through sickness, really heavy losses. That really strong militia regiment identity that existed when they came into Italy, where the guys had trained together before the war, trained during the lead up to the invasion, and they knew each other and they trusted each other. That cohesion has largely been lost by this time because there's all these new guys coming in. Where the Seaforth Highlanders, for example, was a Vancouver-based regiment in British Columbia, with men coming in from the interior of British Columbia to beef them up. Now there could be guys in the Seaforths who are from Prince Edward Island or from Quebec or wherever, just whatever the reinforcement pool can find and dump into the division. So yeah, you're seeing a real running down of things. The 1st Division had suffered within its infantry units alone, the 3 infantry brigades, 2,162 casualties in the Gothic Line. And the conversation that Vokes and Burns are having, which could have been right in this photo, is that First Division is pretty much worn out. It needs to stand down for a while. And so, and you switch the photo again. As the offensive begins, it's 5th Canadian Armored Division that actually moves forward, and it's backed up by the 2nd New Zealand Armored Division, which is put under 1st Canadian Corps Command. And immediately the problems begin, because you can see in this photo, what you see is water. Water, water everywhere. It started to rain the moment they moved forward. Heavier rains than should normally have occurred in September. And they started realizing that the Po Valley, the Emilia-Romagna country, is not what they thought it was. They hadn't. It's actually an amazing error by 8th Army, British 8th Army, and 1st Canadian Corps. They didn't read their maps very well, and they didn't seem to look at their aerial photographs very well. And so they didn't realize that coming out of the Apennine Mountains is a maze of rivers. And they come out of the Apennines and they run laterally west to east across the line of advance that's going to happen. And these rivers have all been channeled by the Italians to prevent flooding. There's a lot of canals that they've created for irrigation purposes, and they all run west to east as well. And so suddenly, this is what they're into. The soil itself is interesting as well. It's a weird type of clay, and when you pour water on it, it turns into this muddy, really deep mud. And it sticks to your shoes. You can walk along and you've got snowshoes of mud attached to you as you're going along. So you're not going to run anywhere because you're hobbling along on this muddy with these snowshoes attached to you. And you can see what happens to the tanks. They just sink right into the mud. There were actually incidents in tanks going into the mud and sinking right up to the top of their turrets and having to be, just abandoned. And you see it again and again. Another classic photo. So the rain is just coming heavier and heavier. Those rivers, you're generally looking at dikes that are 25 feet high on each side. So they provide the Germans exactly what the Germans need, defensive positions. All the Germans have to do is get behind each river, dig in, put their MGs onto the top of the dike, have their artillery and mortars behind them, and they can make life incredibly miserable for the Canadians coming forward. And so that's really the key to the river battles and that's why it's called the river battles, is you're fighting for one river, you get across that, you have maybe another kilometer, 2 to 5 kilometers that you can advance, and then you hit the next river. And so there you see it. And you can see it with this map. The rivers are running along there. It started with the Maricia River on the south, and it keeps going north until they get to the Savio River in October 20th. And in the course of that, there's 5 different rivers that have to get across between September 21 and October the 20th. And each of them, the Germans dig in behind and put up a heavy fight. It's also quite urbanized in a way. So there's a lot of open farm country, but there's a lot of villages. And a lot of those villages had, the buildings had very thick walls, and even walls around the buildings themselves. So each town becomes a potential fort for the Germans, and they use these very well. Lots of church towers, great observation posts for the Germans to direct their artillery from, until we got into the range and could shoot them down with our tanks or our artillery. There's an enormous amount of artillery being used both ways. The Germans and the Allies, the Canadians, are constantly engaging each other in artillery fire, which brings along its own issues because, of course, then the bridges are all getting shot down, the towers, the buildings, roads disrupted. So that advance just keeps crawling forward, and it's not until October 20th or October 16th, really, that 1st Division is now brought back into the play and starts to do what the infantry is supposed to do. Our armored divisions, of course, their role is to gallop forward, which they never got to do. And we'd actually restructured the 4th and 5th Canadian Armored Division had been completely. We had taken a number of units, an anti-aircraft battalion and a armored recce battalion, and unhorsed the both of them from their guns and their reconnaissance vehicles and turned them into infantry to create a 2nd Brigade of infantry for 5th Armored Division so that they could have more infantry punch. And even there, it's primarily because those 2 battalions weren't that well trained as infantry. What infantry training they had would have been back in early 1940s. They've forgotten that. So they had to get retrained to actually fight as infantry. So it's a very different looking Canadian Corps that's going forward. And we can switch photos again. That map.
And is it fair to say, Mark, as well, that the rivers are negating the strengths the Allies should have by this point of the war? We should have lots of artillery. We should have lots of air power. We did a show about Medicina last year with Julian Whippy, and he was saying one of the engineer regiments built 300 Bailey bridges within 3 months or something insane. But of course, Bailey bridges, there's the small type for getting across, jeeps and infantry, and there's the big type to bring the heavy stuff up. So every time you cross a river, you've got to make it manageable to bring up all this core strength stuff, all your heavy artillery, and I'm assuming that the tip of the spear is getting further and further ahead, even though it's by inches away from the base and all this power that theoretically the Allies have got.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And what we weren't seeing is it's always a couple days with most of the rivers. We get the infantry can get across in boats, and they row across, and they were using the collapsible boats. And so they get on the other side. They can establish a beachhead and start fighting their way forward. But it's usually 2 to 3 days at least before the bridges are put in place that can get tanks over and into their support. And so that's another big, and of course, because the Germans are fighting so close to the river and offering opposition, the engineers are pretty much constantly, all of the bridge building they're doing for moving the tanks into the issue, it's all being done under heavy fire. And we see a lot of engineer casualties in the river battles because they're having to do the work totally exposed. And the Germans know where they're building the bridges, so they can bring mortar fire and artillery fire down on them. And this is sort of, like this photo is kind of a typical ridge looking down into one of the rivers, typical the extent of damage that's happening when you're fighting in such a small, congested piece of terrain. Basically most of the villages were destroyed as we went forward. So the fighting was that kind of up close and heavy. This photo is taken actually in Cesena, or pardon me, Bagnacavello. And no, it is Cesena. There was some pretty fast and hard fighting in the streets of these towns. Near here is where Smoky Smith, Seaforth Private, earned his Victoria Cross. So that's the kind of, in Cesena, it was a bigger town, so the amount of damage done to it was less. But but and the armor was able to get in and actually push the Germans out. And so it was one of the battles that went quite well with us. And you can switch to photos again. That's a 17-pounder, by the way. So not all of Cesena escaped damage is the example of the kind of damage that occurs there. Using German prisoners to help evacuate the wounded. That was kind of common. The Seaforths and the Loyal Edmonton regiments, both of 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, went forward to take the road, the Cesena to Ravenna, and we can switch photos again. And so this is the start line of the Seaforth advance towards the Savio River. They had to cross another river that was fairly narrow on that thing. And so this gives you a good example of the kind of dikes that existed. All the rivers had these dikes, good 25 feet high from the down where that muddy ditch is on the right-hand side. And you can also get a good idea of how the conditions were. It's cold, it's wet. By this point, they've been having a month and a half of rain, fighting out there. Every time they want to engage the Germans, what they have to do is crawl up to the top of that dike and start firing across, because the Germans are just on the other side. And this is kind of the typical situation that they faced, and you can switch photos again.
And meanwhile, waiting for them is, yeah,
the Germans, and the Germans were using their armor quite well. They were, because of the roads tended to work the same way as the rivers. They tended to run east-west. They could get their tanks and they could run back and forth along the roads to wherever the hot spot was that they had to get to. And so they were quite able to bring their armor to bear. They didn't have a lot of tigers, but they did have one group of tigers that they divvied out, and so there would be just one tiger in a specific place. But their firepower facing the Canadian armor was still pretty devastating. And
it's analyzed, isn't it? I mean, it seems to me the problem is that they know where the Canadians are going to appear from. They know where the ruins are. They know where the bridges are, the crossing points. They can see them coming over these dikes. So you only kind of need one decent weapon in the right place, and you've got perfect potential ambush.
Yes, and that's exactly what they do. And so it's very hard. It's very hard for the Canadians to get a broad front attack going because of just the logistics of it, trying to get across the rivers. So, what we see is sort of generally 2 battalions being able to make a jump across one of the rivers in one specific place, with the Germans concentrating their firepower against them. And so there are certain opportunities that present themselves, and that's what happens on the night in October 20th, the 22nd of that area, when the Canadians do get across the river Savio and start moving towards this road that runs from Cesena to Ravenna. And that's where the Seaforths end up reaching a church, and we can switch photos again. And so this is the reason I've got this at the 20 infantrymen. So the Seaforth Highlanders and the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, during the last stage of the Gothic line, had realized that they were facing enough tanks that they needed some way of fighting back. And so what they did is they created what they call tank killing squads. And these were made up of 20 men. And you can switch to the photo again. And they had 4 Piat guns. So 1 for every 5 men. They also had the Hawkins grenades, which are that what looks like a little liquid container, and then Bren guns. And so they would make daisy chains of these and run them across the roads, and then try and blow up anything that came along. So the Seaforth Highlanders, and you can switch photos again. This is the Savio River. Seaforth Highlanders waded that river. It was much wider in those days. This is a photo I took when I was doing research. It was probably about 3 times that width. Now, all of these rivers, it's another weird thing about the river battles, is when you're researching it today and you go and visit the battle site, you look at the rivers and you say, well, that's kind of inconsequential because they're all much smaller now than they used to be. There's been a lot of diversions happen, so the flooding, the big rivers that came out of the Apennines are no longer active in the same way. And so the vegetation's taken back the river channels, and they've gotten quite narrow and shallow. So anyway, they went across in boats. It was about 20 feet wide at that time. And the Seaforth Highlanders end up at this church. It had been badly damaged at that point, of course, but they restored it exactly as it was at the time. So what you see today is what the church looked like yesterday in 1944. And what you can't see there, but where that brick house on the left is, there's a highway that runs across there. That's the highway running from Cesena to Ravenna. And so this is where the Seaforth Highlanders set up, and they lay an ambush to try and catch the Germans, who are now desperately trying to get out of Cesena and run towards Ravenna. That's where they really wanted to go. And so it's nighttime, and we can switch the photo again. And here's the guys. This is one of the tank killing squads. And the photo includes Smokey Smith, who is sitting in the left-hand corner, the one with the beret, and the fellow's got his hand on his shoulder.
Yep.
So Smokey was quite young. His nickname, Smokey, comes from in Vancouver. He was a runner in track and field events, and he always, as they said, smoked the competition. And so that's where the nickname Smokey comes from, Alvina Smith. Now the Seaforth tank hunting team, and you can switch the photo again. They're dug in, and they've got Hawkins mines across the road, and along comes one of these little Kubo wagons with an officer and party in it. It raced right across the Hawkins grenades, didn't set it off. It was too light. But it starts, the fighting starts. The tank hunters had the Bren machine guns. They open up and they kill the Germans who were in that Kubo wagon. You can switch the photo again. And coming along behind them, that is 3 of these Panthers and a self-propelled weapon and another self-propelled gun. So there's a lot of armor coming, but there's also, and you can switch the photo again, about 30 German Panzer Grenadiers scattered around on top of the armor that are riding on the armor. And so the fighting starts right away. And the Germans are pretty good. You were looking at the 26th Panzer Division here. They were a pretty crack group of infantry and tankers. The fully tracked SPG, pictured here, gets a track blown off by the Hawkins grenades. It's disabled and it turns sideways and blocks the road. So the ones behind them can't get past them. The Seaforths chucked grenades into the open hatch of that tank self-propelled gun, and killed the Germans inside it. The fight here at this point now turns into a swirling brawl. Behind the SPG is a Panther. It's backing up and trying to escape from the fire. There's two Piat teams, not Smokey's group, in the ditches on either side of this road. They're firing Piat rounds at them, but they're just hitting the front of the tank, and that's the Piat is useless against frontal armor. It's a not a awful self-propelled grenade launcher, but it's not a very good one, and it's an awkward beast to fire, and it's slow to reload. It's got a hell of a recoil, and so difficult weapon to use. These guys were very good. They knew what they were doing with them because they've been training on them a lot. But the tank, meanwhile, it swings around and starts to try and go down a farm lane next to the church. You can switch to photo again. And this is a rather romanticized vision of the whole battle, but it gives you an idea. So Smokey and his team, there's the three men in the team, are in one of the ditches at the farm road that they're now moving beside the church. Smokey is at this point not armed with nowadays, well, you can sort of see a ditch where the cars are parked. That's an original ditch from the time, and the ditch on the other side of the road has been filled in. But there were two ditches, and there was a guy with a Piat gun in here in the ditch that's to the left, and he started engaging the Panther. So there were three men: Private K.W. Ballard, Private James Tennant. Each of them had a Piat, and Smokey Smith was providing cover with the Thompson submachine gun. As the Panther comes forward, it's spewing machine gun fire, and Tennant gets hit very badly in the leg by a bullet. So he's very badly wounded. Smith slings the Thompson behind his back, and he grabs up the Piat. And as he put it, our way was to fight from the ditches and wait until they got real close, 30 feet or less, because you don't want to fire at a tank with a Piat and miss, because if you miss, you're dead. They have the machine guns, and they'll just eat you alive. Smith fires the Piat. He hits the Panther squarely, and his driver started frantically trying to turn around to escape the line of fire. And the Germans, meanwhile, those Panzer Grenadiers that are riding on the back of it, they chuck about 10 grenades towards Smith, and then they all bail off the back of the tank and start running towards him with their Schmeissers firing, and some of them still throwing more stick grenades. Now, Smith has a choice to make here. His boyhood friend, because James Tennant and he had grown up together. James is lying in the ditch. He's badly wounded. He can't get off on his own. Smith has a choice to make. He can run, or he can stand and fight. And Smith decides to stand and fight. To divert the fire away from James Tennant, he actually steps out into the middle of the road with a submachine gun and starts firing at the Germans. He kills 4 of them at point blank range. And as the 4th falls, the other 6 guys turn around and run. Now, a second Panther, sitting up by that brick house there, that's in the distance on the left-hand side, starts firing down the road towards Smith and them. Smith now takes Tennant and carries him to the church, where he hands him over to the regimental aid post people. And then he gets another Piat and some ammunition, and he comes back to his position here and begins to engage the other tank with the Piat fire. It's this action that actually leads to his earning the Victoria Cross, as the citation actually said he steadfastly held his position, protecting his comrade and fighting the enemy with his Tommy gun until they finally gave up and withdrew in disorder. Well, there's a little more to it than that. You can switch the photo again. With the farm road, that's a photo of Smokey. And with the farm road blocked, and by that SPG, the half track was with the group, tries to break across country. It got knocked out by another Piet round from the other teams. The Panther that's been shooting at Smith tried to squeeze past the SPG, and it slid into a water-filled ditch. And then a Piet round set it on fire. And the third and last Panther, its crew it gets stuck in the mud as well. Its crew bails out. A couple of them are shot dead, and the rest flee. And that's the end of the battle. The entire action took less than an hour. So Smokey earns the third and final Victoria Cross the Canadians in Italy were awarded with. And he's also the only private soldier in the Canadian Army to receive a Victoria Cross. In the aftermath, there was some debate about whether he should have got the cross or the sergeant who actually led the team. But yeah, anyway, he got it. And now he was a bit of a rogue. He looks a bit impish in this photo. Smokey was a great combat soldier, but out of the line, he always got himself into trouble. He liked to drink. He liked to party. He was promoted 3 times, I believe, and each time demoted back to private because of the things he did out of the line. So when they decided to send him to England to get the Victoria Cross from King George, they locked him in a hotel room and wouldn't let him out until it was time for him to get the award because they knew he'd go out and get drunk. And so they finally, they present him with the Victoria Cross. They then also told him that he couldn't show anyone the citation for 2 days, I think it was, to allow time for it to be announced in Canada that he had received the Victoria Cross. And he said once they gave him the high sign that it was okay for him to talk about it, he went immediately to a bar and never had to buy a drink again for the entire time he was in England until they eventually sent him back to Canada. He doesn't come back into action again, which was typical of most Canadian Victoria Cross winners. Curry being the exception, who got it at St. Lambert-sur-Dives. He continued to serve with the tanks right through to the end of the war. But usually they were pulled out because, for one thing, you didn't want your Victoria Cross person killed. And for another thing, it was really good to use them to promote and sell war bonds and promote recruitment and things like that back home in Canada. So we can switch away from
absolutely brilliant stuff, by the way, Mark. That's an extraordinary story. Even though some of us have heard it before, it never ceases to impress. That story. It's one of those ones that if you put it in a comic strip, people would say, "Oh, you're making it up." It has all the ingredients.
Actually, that photo that has him firing machine guns from the comic strip. There was these, they were American published as well, which was kind of interesting. But they have these, a number of them that have Canadian stories in them, and they're actually quite effective. So this is another classic photo of the immediate task that immediately sets with the Savio River. And now we see the Savio as wide as it was when in World War II, not the ditch that I took the photo of. Fairly crude bridge, just putting it on top of boats, but heavy enough, strong enough that they could get trucks across. It was called the Last Hope Bridge because it took them so long to build it. They lost the bridge numerous times to German fire, and they were trying to build a better Bailey Bridge at that time. And they realized that they just don't have the time or the ability to do that under the artillery fire that's there. So they throw this up because they can fix it really easy. If it gets shot apart, though, you know, you can see the where that left back wheel is. You can see where it's kind of hooked together on the left-hand side there. So you can tear this thing apart pretty fast if you need to, slam in some new pieces, and get a couple more trucks across until such time as the bridge gets shot apart again. And you can switch to the photo. Now, by this time, the 8th Army has a new commander. This is Richard McCreary. And McCreary takes a good hard look at 1st Canadian Corps, and he sees a lot of weakness there. And the weakness that he sees is Lieutenant General Tommy Burns, who's commanding the Corps. Burns was a World War I veteran, and he took over command. He came and, you know, took command of 1st Canadian Corps before its first combat actions in the casino area. And he had not performed well in there. The division, the 2 divisions, 5th Division and 1st Division, performed extremely well. But at the Corps level, things were always a bit of a muddle. And this doesn't improve as time goes on. Burns is a stickler for protocol. He loved to have his soldiers wear good, proper uniforms and keep themselves clean and everything like that, which is pretty hard to do in the mud of Italy. And the 2 generals, Major General Chris Vokes and Major General Bert Hoffmeister, who commanded the 2 divisions, by the time they get out into the river battles, they've lost all confidence in Burns. And they're doing workarounds. They're using their connections within the Corps command to get what they want without talking to Burns. And McCreary is smart enough that he understands this and what's going on. And, you know, basically, so he calls the Vokes and Hoffmeister to a meeting, and they both say, yeah, we don't have any confidence in Burns anymore. Hoffmeister goes to the point that he has been thinking about resigning unless the Canadians replace Burns. So first, it has to be done by Canadians. McCreary can't fire Burns on his own, though he'd certainly like to. So he makes a plea to the Canadian 1st Canadian Army's Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, who's up in Northwest Europe. And Crerar gets the green light from Ottawa and the government to, yes, you can get rid of Burns. So who to replace him with? And you can switch photos. This is General Chris Vokes, Major General Chris Vokes, commanding 1st Canadian Infantry Division. He initially takes over as Corps commander, and he thinks, well, it's a done deal. I'm going to be the Corps commander. But Crerar has never liked Chris Vokes. It's a lot of personality stuff happening here. Who Crerar decides to send is Major General Charles Vokes. Vokes. And Crerar actually in writing puts in folks, not folks. And then you can switch photos.
And at this point of the war, how much of this tension between commanding officers do you think now, with the benefit of 80 years historiography and reflection, is just weariness and fatigue? Everybody's just getting a bit frayed around the edges. You know, I mean, I'm not necessarily defending or criticizing them, but, you know, when we said earlier, they've been at it a long time, some of these people. You see it across the globe in 44, 45. Commanders just, they're running on empty. Is that again a fair comment?
It is a fair comment, and the problem in Canadian, it's exacerbated with the Canadians because we don't have a big officer corps.
Yeah.
We went into the war with not a lot of, not a big professional army. And so a lot of these guys, they're First World War veterans. So they're a little long in the tooth for this kind of fighting. Crerar, for example, is at the point where he is smoking a pack of cigarettes a day because his nerves are not in great shape. Burns, I think he was promoted above his ability, basically because they needed a corps commander and they didn't have a lot to choose from. So he gets tossed into the job. Folks, who's the person with the hat, he's standing next to the guy in the trench coat, which is McCreary. He's a politician more than a general. His command, he's not been particularly good. He commanded the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division in Normandy. He was in command during the fighting on Verrier Ridge, and he excelled by not actually exerting any kind of command and control over anything. He left it up to his brigadiers to do what Lieutenant General Guy Simmons told them to do. And he's amazing by his absence from everything. And so he arrives in Italy in a very bumpy start. The Canadian Corps headquarters arrived at an airport. They're all ready with the band and everything to welcome their new Corps commander. But his plane gets misdirected and lands at an airstrip in another part of the area completely. There's nobody there on the airstrip at all. It's abandoned. There's just a couple Canadian mechanics working on a broken down truck that they're trying to get going. Folks walks over with his suitcase and identifies himself as the commander. The sergeant who's repairing the truck turns to him and says that he's lying. He says, "I know full well what General Vokes looks like, and you ain't him." And he goes back to working on his car. Folks wanders out of the airport, finally flags down a ride from, say, 8th Army people who are coming by, and they take him to 8th Army headquarters, where he was eventually given a lift to the Canadian Corps to arrive to take over his command. He is furious and tears a strip off his brigadier, George Kitching. And basically, the situation never gets healed. It's soon obvious that Chris Vokes and Charles Vokes cannot work together. Vokes really did think that he was going to get the Corps command, and he has no respect for Vokes anyway from past experience. So Vokes gets relieved and promoted. We don't tend to relieve people in the Canadian Army in World War II. We move them. And so Chris Vokes is considered a fairly good combat general. So he gets moved to Northwest Europe and takes over 4th Canadian Armored Division with no experience in commanding tanks ever. He's been an infantry division guy, engineer before the war, then became an infantry division commander. And his replacement is Major General Harry Foster, who comes from 4th Canadian Armored Division and takes over 1st Division. That's a good move because Foster actually was a really good infantry division commander. He knew his stuff, and we can switch photos again.
Yeah.
And that's Harry Foster there. He's younger as well. That doesn't hurt because that's another problem we're seeing is a lot of our generals are starting to get a bit old. So now we actually have 2 really good generals in Italy, because Major General Bert Hofmeister, who commands the 5th Armored Division, even by this time, the Canadians are saying that he's pretty much the best divisional commander they've got. He's very good. He came up through the ranks as a Seaforth. He was started as a boy soldier in the Seaforths before the war, and he rose very quickly to command the Seaforth Highlanders when they went into Sicily. By the time he gets to Ortona, he's commanding 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, and then shortly after Ortona, January 1944, he's given the command of 5th Canadian Armored Division, and he does a very good job of it. And we can switch photos again.
Oops. Oh, no, that's it. Yeah. Sorry, there we go.
There we go. And this is Well, we were playing around with who's going to command what. October 25th, October 26th, the heavy rains that are happening become even heavier. It's the worst rainstorms the Canadians have ever encountered in Italy. And the bridges just get swept away. All the bridges across all the rivers from Rimini up towards Ravenna are lost. That pretty much just stops the situation. And November, we can switch photos again. November is not a lot of operations occur because the weather is just so bad. And then they return into action in late November, early December, and you can see the conditions that they're fighting in now. It never improves. The rains are, it's the worst. We are now in the worst winter that Europe has experienced in 50 years. And they're just, in Italy, it's a nightmare. It's just impossible to continue. There's advances won, but it becomes just this grim affair. You can switch photos again. So by late November, though, there's almost 1,000 partisans involved in fighting with the Canadians or in supporting them. They're organized into what's called the Garibaldi Brigade. It's under command of Lieutenant Erigio Baldrini, and he went by the nom de guerre Major Bullo. And they were operating actually out of a safe haven in the swamps and marshes north of Ravenna. And but there's a lot of partisan action, and I can't remember her name now, and I don't have the note. This is actually a photo taken in Bagnacavallo, and she and the fellow standing next to her are both brother and sister partisans, and he will actually get killed the next week in fighting with the Germans. She survives the war, and her other brother was also fighting with the partisans. An awful lot of the young Italians in this area by this time have gone over into the partisans. They've gone into hiding in the swamps. And you can switch photos. There's a lot of problems with the civilians have been driven into shelters. This particular photo was taken at Bagnacavallo. It's in a convent. And there were actually almost 1,000 Italian civilians hiding in this convent in the cellars. So there was a lot of trouble with food supplies, getting them into them, and a very difficult situation. So they're also, so basically they're facing a humanitarian crisis that's developing as well. And that causes a lot of problems for the Canadians as well, because their quartermaster staffs are trying to figure out how to feed these people, how to get medical aid to them. It's not something they're geared up to do, and the supply networks are not that good. We saw the bridges are being lost as well. So, to have extra trucks coming across with food to take to Italians who are starving is a real burden and a difficulty. And you can switch photos again.
Yeah, and I read somewhere recently, Mark, that there's a suggestion that the Germans knew that the Allies would be stopping and looking after these essentially refugees and people, and it was part of their almost like a scorched earth, but not kind of policy, a policy of delaying. Did you believe that?
I think so. I think, what we're seeing here, well, the German strategy had always been to delay and delay and delay as much as they can. In this kind of situation, you've got, you can really, create a lot of devastation with the artillery and the tanks and that. And they were doing that. This picture is taken in a town called Conventello, I should say. And, you know, you can see the situation. You get a sense of how dire things are.
Yeah.
German tank in the background. This woman's carrying a door to somewhere, probably to help, you know, reinforce a basement shelter. You know, so the situation is getting, you know, very dire. And you can switch photos too. So finally, the December 24th, the Canadians reached the Senio River. And at this point, they're just north of Ravenna. We've liberated Ravenna. It was actually the Garibaldi Brigade, the partisans who first liberate the city. They come out of the marshes and pushed into the city to spare it from being hit by shelled by Canadian artillery and bombed by the RCAF and RAF, because it's an ancient old Roman town, and they're fearful of it being destroyed. Like everything else, that delaying issue that we've been talking about. So that's December 24th. They get to the Senio River. The weather's still awful. The decision is just to stay put. There won't be any offensive actions at all. And you can switch photos. So now the issue really becomes staying warm in a trench warfare. It's like going back to World War I. So this is an improvised stove made out of an ammunition box and some piping, you know, hooked together. Artillery guys in this photo. And so most of the common soldiers think that they're destined to be in Italy until the war ends, and you can switch photos. And that's not the case. As January turned to February, the 1st Canadian Corps started to leave Italy. It was called Operation Goldflake. It took place between February 7th to the beginning of March. And we basically moved the entire Canadian Corps secretly to Leghorn and Naples, and then they were moved by ship to Marseille, and they moved by train and convoys up to Belgium and joined 1st Canadian Army for operations in the liberation of the Netherlands. And we can switch photos. The interesting thing I should mention about Operation Goldflake is the Germans had no idea what was going on, and they continued to show Canadian divisions active on the front until the middle of April. So there was we were gone for like a month, 6 weeks before they realized we were gone. Behind, we left a lot of Canadians who died in the river battles. Now, this interesting thing about this, and I did a lot of research on this, the official tally was 2,581 men killed or wounded in the river battles. But in researching the book, I realized there was a big data loss in how they kept track of the casualties. The statistics I dug up showed the losses being far higher and actually quite appalling. From September 22nd, 1944 to February 1st, 1945, there were 7,214 casualties, and 1,276 of those were fatal. That accounts for almost a quarter of all the Canadians' Italian campaign casualties. And it's something that, you know, has been missed. And what happened is the losses suffered in the first part of the campaign were rolled back into the losses suffered in the Gothic line.
Right.
And that one was inflated and this one deflated just by statistical confusion. Basically, I don't think they thought they were into a campaign in the last half of September and the first half of October. They weren't seeing this as an operational campaign. And so the data just got crunched in the wrong directions. And this is the Carleton and York Regiment. Their graveyard at a place called Villanova. It then becomes the Villanova Canadian War Cemetery. And that's the last photo. It comes up next, I think.
Just your
and
book. Yeah.
And there we are. We're done. And so the river battles. I think the main thing to really take away from this was it was a battle fought by really at a battalion and almost a company level, platoon level. So generalship didn't really factor in much other than keep the supplies coming. The actual fighting was being organized and led forward by company commanders, battalion commanders, even platoon commanders. And it really was the grit of the individual soldier that, in the end of the day, won this. And it's interesting, although that geography is only, the 15 by 24 kilometer square area, and this was an Italian historian who pointed this out to me when I was doing research there. It's the only place that any ground is won on the Allied front during this particular operation of those months, September to January of 45. So we actually won some ground. Whether it was important or not is another issue. But they did take Ravenna, and ultimately they did what they were supposed to do, which is keep the pressure on the Germans, keep sucking them into battle, and prevent them from being able to send units away from Italy.
But keeping Germans out of the battle, out from other sectors, isn't sexy. It doesn't make headlines, does it? And you're talking about this change of command. You're clear about the fact the heroes here were the platoon leaders and the sergeants and the corporals and things, and they aren't the guys who wrote the memoirs. They aren't the guys steering the way the press is going. I'm also assuming by early 45, the press has kind of got one eye on victory in Europe now. They're thinking that the game is, it's the last few lengths now. So I can see now, 80 years on, or nearly 80 years on, why this kind of campaign has just fallen through the cracks somewhat. It's not sexy. It's not. There's no real victory parades. There's no liberation of grateful civilians everywhere you go. There's hunger and poverty and death and decay. So it takes people like yourself essentially to write about it and find these stories of heroism and military interest out of what is, in some ways, quite a negative campaign. In fact, negative odd word, but you know what I mean by that.
Yeah, no, it's true, and we see that actually. When I was doing the research, it was hard to get a lot of photos of the fighting in the river battles because even the Canadian Army photographers, most of them are gone.
They're somewhere else.
They've all gone to Northwest Europe. There's just a handful, 2 or 3 of these guys around. And the other thing is, there had been a couple Canadian photographers, Army photographers killed in Italy. And what I started seeing is an awful lot of photos taken in the rear, and not the kind of photos you saw, 6 months earlier where the guys were out on the front lines taking photos. And, it's understandable. You don't want to die in Italy taking photos.
And you don't want to die, especially, again, when you see the end in sight. People are less keen to take risks when they feel that there's momentum is with the Allies now. It's just a matter of time. Perhaps in 42, 43, you're a young, ambitious correspondent wanting to get the story. But by 45, if you're still alive, you're thinking about kind of moving back to the sports desk almost.
It's true. And that was the other thing is the reporters themselves, the Canadian press and that, they had largely left Italy. Yeah. They were gone. So that's a real problem. And that's, we didn't see that much news actually on him. Like Strom Galloway, one of the Royal Canadian Regiment major, said he used to get letters from home where they'd say, "What are you doing? We never read about you anymore." And that started really after June 6, 1944, when
Yeah, no, well,
happens.
that opens up the whole rabbit hole of why certain battles get reported and other battles don't get reported, and why certain books subjects still get 20 books a year and some get one book every 20 years. It's another big discussion. But I'm going to leave it there, Mark, because you're a busy man. Back to the word mines. Carry on with the next project. I won't leave it as long this time before I invite you back for something else. I will not leave it 2.5 years. I will be in touch sooner. So I remind everybody that the links to Mark's book that's relevant to today is in the description below, but they're all worth getting. I've got a little Mark section on my bookshelf in the other room. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everybody for watching. I will see you at the same time again tomorrow, folks, to talk about a Royal Canadian Air Force bomber squadron in World War II, which will be fascinating. So thanks everybody. Thanks Mark. Thanks
Paul.
Bye then. Bye.
Bye.